Anytime we plant a seed, it's an act of faith. And I don't care how many years one has been gardening, I think we all feel a sort of nervousness after we plant that seed as we're waiting for it to sprout. Often beginning gardeners think that this is the biggest hurdle, getting the seeds to emerge. But I can tell you, lack of germination, while it does happen, isn't nearly as common as some other problems that occur after sprouting. And sadly, in many cases, by the time we identify the problem, it's too late. Raise your hand if you've ever been there and you had to make the decision of whether you're going to keep nursing the plant to hopefully help it get better, even though it really doesn't look all that healthy, or you have to decide whether you're going to start over. It is not a fun place to be, and it's not an enjoyable way to start your garden year. If you're new here, I'm Jill, and I just want to welcome you to the episode today. In this episode, my goal is to help you to prevent some of the most common seed starting issues I see people encounter every single year. That way, you'll have a better opportunity for the seed starting success that you want to have. Let's talk about preventing seed starting problems. Much of this I have in a free download called Seed Starting Troubleshooting Guide. You can grab that below in the description. So if you're multitasking, you don't have to take notes here. Plus, this guide will go even more in depth into some of the things that we don't have time to discuss today. So just make sure that you grab it before you finish this episode. The number one most common problem I see with indoor seed starting every single year is leggy seedlings. If you've ever had leggy seedlings, you know what they look like, but if you haven't, let me tell you what to look for. Leggy seedlings are going to be really tall, spindly, thin seedlings with really short leaves at the top. They just don't look healthy, and even if you've never done any indoor seed starting, you can look at it and think something doesn't look right here because there is a problem with the plant being stressed in some way. There are several reasons that your seedlings can be leggy, and I'm going to go through 5 of them with you right now, but the most common one is lack of sufficient light. So in order to prevent leggy seedlings that get that way because they don't have enough light, use a grow light. This is something that I try to tell people and shout from the rooftops every single year. Please do not try to rely on your sunny south-facing window. It most of the time will not work, especially if you're in the Northern Hemisphere and you're starting your seedlings in January, February, even March. The angle of the sun itself, the length of the days is not like it will be in the late spring and the early summer. So even if you do have a south-facing window, it's not enough cumulative light. The angle isn't where it needs to be. Now, if you did a sunny south-facing window in the middle of the summer, you might have more success, but definitely not this time of year. So if you hear nothing else from me, get a grow light. Any kind of grow light that is specifically made for growing seedlings indoors will be better than nothing. So that's one way to prevent leggy seedlings. Number 2, make sure that light is close enough to the top of the plants. In my experience, I've used very inexpensive LED lights. I've had them for years. I have the ones that I use, I'll list in the description from the Amazon shop. I think they're like $30-$40 or something like that. So I've used that, and then also I use T5 fluorescent lights, which are my favorite. But for both of those, the top of the plant needs to be about 3 to 6 inches away from that grow light. 6 inches is pretty much the standard, but I have found, especially when those seedlings are young, when they have just sprouted, the closer you can get the light to them, the better. As they grow, the more distance you could safely get between the tops of the leaves and the light, but make sure that the leaves are close enough to the light. Now, if you have a high-powered LED light, a lot of times you need a lot more room or you could burn your seedlings, but my guess is that if you're a beginning gardener, you're probably not ponying up the cash for an LED light like that. So for most home gardeners, about 3 to 6 inches is probably what you're going to want to start with. Number 3, don't overplant per cell. Don't overseed your seedlings, because here's what's going to happen. Most of your seeds are going to germinate. And if you're planting with a regular cell, you're eventually just going to want 1 plant per cell. Well, if you plant 20 seeds or even 10 seeds in that one cell, you're going to have to eventually take out those extras. And I know it's really hard, but that's going to be number one, wasting seeds. But until you even get to that point, they're going to be competing against each other. They're going to be competing for light, for space, for ventilation, for root space. That is another thing that can make plants leggy, is overplanting. Now, there is a method called the dense planting method where you plant a whole lot of seeds in one cell. I use this for my tomatoes and my peppers, but once they germinate, they get separated and transplanted in their own cell. This is not what you are probably doing as a beginner. You're probably going to want that plant to stay in the cell for a little while. So if you're not planning on separating your seedlings, then definitely don't overseed. You want about 2 to 3 seeds per cell. Number 4, turn off your seedling heat mat after germination. A seedling heat mat isn't something that is required, but it's definitely helpful, especially for your warm season crops or your hot season crops. Tomatoes benefit, peppers for sure benefit. It also depends on the temperature of the room. So if your room is more in the 65 degrees, a seedling heat mat can definitely help. But what you want to do is take that mat off after the seeds germinate. If that soil starts heating up too much after the seeds have sprouted, they're basically going to want to get out from that heat. So they're going to keep growing straight up. Think about if you have too many blankets on you, and you get hot, you want to shed that heat. So that's basically what the seedlings are going to do if the soil is too hot. Once germination has occurred, the seedling heat mat has mostly done its job. So you can take your seedling heat mat off. There may be exceptions, such as if you're growing in a really cold room, you might find some benefit of leaving it on. But if you are growing in a room temperature room, then you want to take that seedling heat mat off after germination. And number 5, too much fertilization can cause leggy seedlings. What can happen is that if you pump your seedlings full of extra nutrients, then it's going to give them the vigor to grow, but they don't have the root system to support that top growth yet. So they're going to keep growing up and up, but they don't have the root system to support that, so they get really weak. What you want to do then is delay any kind of fertilization. I rarely, if ever, fertilize my seedlings until they start getting true leaves and like several sets of true leaves. In fact, often I don't even fertilize my seedlings until I pot them up personally. Different gardeners will do this different ways, but if you do fertilize using a liquid fertilizer, make sure to use it at half strength. Don't ever use it at full strength. Oftentimes they'll have instructions on the box that says this is the strength you want to use if you're doing seedlings as opposed to a regular plant. But my advice is to don't be in a rush to fertilize your seedlings. And if you already have leggy seedlings, don't be in a rush to give them extra nutrients. That's not going to help. I know that's one thing we want to do. If our seedlings don't look good, we just want to feed them. And sometimes that can do more harm than good. So those are the 5 things that you can do to prevent leggy seedlings. The second thing that is very common with indoor seed starting is stunted seedlings. This is something that can happen to all of us, but here are a few things that you can do to prevent it. Stunted seedlings are basically seedlings that just aren't growing very well, or they don't look healthy. They're not progressing at the rate that they need to progress. So that's kind of the definition of stunted seedlings. And as a beginner, it may be hard for you to know what's normal. So that's something that you'll learn mostly with experience. But first, use a seed starting mix and use a high quality seed starting mix. You don't want any kind of raised bed soil or garden soil or anything that has soil in it. You want a mix. And I would recommend that you use a seed starting mix because it's already been sifted and there's not any large chunks in it. Those large chunks can hurt the seedling as it's starting to germinate. This potting mix is perfectly fine to pot up in, but for seed starting, you want a really fine tilth, and you can get that easily by using a seed starting mix. An alternative, and this is what I use to save money, is I'll take potting mix and I'll sift it so that way the large chunks are out, and I'll use that as a seed starting mix. One thing I would recommend is that you use care or use caution in using mixes with coconut coir. This is an area that I've just seen other people that have used a coir mix I've seen my fair share of stunted seedlings with people that I'll say, what kind of seed starting mix did you use? And they told me it was a core-based mix. Now, I will say that I tried this back in the fall. I was doing some testing of different seed starting mix, and I used a core mix, and it did perfectly fine for me. So I do think it depends on the brand. Hopefully they're getting better. I think the problem is the core tends to have too much salt. So maybe they're getting better with, rinsing and flushing that salt. I think sometimes it just depends on the brand. So all that to say, just use care if you use something with a core mix. And if you find yourself having some stunted seedlings and you have used the core mix, you might want to transplant into something that's not core and see if it does any better. Also, I would recommend to avoid mixes with moisture retaining properties. You'll see that on the bag. The reason is because overwatering is an issue, especially with seedlings. You want to make sure that they have enough oxygen. And the moisture retaining properties, while it's great for containers, it's not so great for seedlings. So I would avoid that if you can. The second thing to avoid stunted seedlings is to use the right size cell tray. Now, if you're a beginner, you just buy one of those, seed starting packs. That will be fine. But you may find yourself tempted to use something a little different, maybe to save some money. If you go with too small of a cell tray or something to sow your seeds in, I'm thinking eggshells. I see that a lot. If you break your eggshell in half and you decide to grow your seedling in half of an eggshell, that's okay for sprouting, but that eggshell does not have enough room for the roots to be able to develop long term. So that can actually cause the seedlings to stunt if you have too small of a cell. On the opposite end, and I made this mistake last year with celery, is I started my celery seedlings in too large of a container. And the reason why that was problematic was that my soil got too saturated and it eventually just robbed the soil of oxygen, and the roots were starved of oxygen. Now, this is a little bit different depending on the plant. If it's a fast growing plant like a squash or a tomato, I could have started it in that size and been just fine because the roots, they grow fast. But if I'm talking about something that has a little bit slower growing roots, like celery, for instance, it needs a smaller container because too large of a container can cause problems with moisture regulation. Which brings us to number 3 to prevent stunted seedlings, and that is don't overwater. This can cause root rot, and what happens with that root rot is that eventually the roots are having trouble taking up water. So even though it's overwatered, the plant actually suffers from lack of water because the roots can't take it up. My trick for water regulation is to use the weight of the tray. This is something a little bit hard to describe, but the weight of the tray is something that you want to keep an eye on. Whenever you have your soil properly saturated, pick it up and just feel what it feels like. And then you can get an idea when it gets too light, when it gets a lot more light than that, then you want to add water. Oftentimes, especially if your seedlings are under a fluorescent grow light that produces a lot of heat, oftentimes the top of that soil will look bone dry, but the bottom is well watered. The way you can figure out whether your seedlings actually need water is to know what it feels like when you pick it up. Oh, this is really light. I need more water. Or now this is plenty wet. I don't need to water yet, even if the top is a little bit crusty. So that's a little trick that I use, and it tends for me to work. You can get moisture meters, but to me, just starting to get an idea of what the weight feels like has been really helpful. Another thing is to don't fertilize too early. Excessive fertilizer can actually damage plant roots, and it again keeps them from taking up water efficiently. My recommendation is to plan to fertilize once a few sets of true leaves appear, because the first leaves that emerge are the cotyledons. They are the seed leaves. They have enough nutrition to be able to feed the plant. It's when the seed leaves emerge that they start using photosynthesis and acquiring nutrients from the soil. I wouldn't fertilize until then, and even then I would be very light-handed with it. Another thing you can do to prevent stunted seedlings is don't keep your grow light on for 24 hours a day. I know sometimes it's tempting to do that, but plants need rest. I usually keep mine on for about 16 hours. I think 14 to 16 is recommended most of the time, but your seedlings don't need 24 hours a day. They need a rest from the light as well. And then finally, make sure the temperature of the room is between 65 and 75 degrees ambient temperature. Now, this will vary by the plant. A cool season crop will be able to do a little bit better in cooler temperatures. Warm season crop is going to like it warmer than that. But especially if you're trying to grow in an unheated basement or something like that, you might want to consider a space heater if it's too cold. I would just really monitor the temperature of your room if you start seeing that your seedlings are stunted. I will tell you that just from my anecdotal experience growing in a greenhouse, it's incredible the difference that heat makes, especially heat at night. Even if the greenhouse is 48 degrees compared to 34, the plants thrive. Even the cool season crops thrive. So the heat of the room being the proper temperature makes a difference. And finally, the third thing we're going to talk about to try to prevent some common issues with seed starting is to prevent wilting seedlings. Now, wilting seedlings can be caused by several different things, but most of the time it's a water issue. The tricky thing is that you don't really know whether it's underwatering or overwatering unless you look at some other signs. My first recommendation to prevent wilting seedlings is don't overwater. We overwater our seedlings in general more than we underwater them. What happens, as I mentioned before, is they get starved for oxygen. That soil needs oxygen pockets. The roots need that. So if you're overwatering, the water is filling that space and there's no oxygen for that. I do recommend bottom watering, which means watering the tray so that the roots in the soil can take up the water from the bottom. But even then, be careful not to over bottom water because then your trays will be sitting in water and there's no room for the oxygen to have a place in the soil. So be careful that they don't sit in water. If you accidentally overwater them, you can take a baster and remove the excess water. That's a little bit of a pain. So I would recommend just to water a little bit, see how fast they get taken up. Feel the weight before you bottom water, add a little bit, feel the weight after. Is it significantly more heavy or not? If it is, then you're probably good for now, but just be careful not to overwater. On the other hand, make sure to water sufficiently. I know that's hard to switch here, but especially if you're growing your seedlings in an area that you don't pass by every day. In my house, I'm growing my seedlings in our grow/playroom, which is the room in our main hallway. So I'm walking back and forth every day. There's no way I can forget about my seedlings. But if you are growing yours in a basement or in an out-of-the-way room and you just don't think of it all the time, then that's something you'll probably be more apt to forget about them and underwater. So that's obviously something that you want to make sure and water sufficiently. Also, keep in mind that the bigger your plants grow, the more water they're going to need. The first few weeks, you're going to be like, okay, they still don't need water. Okay, they still don't need water. But then, especially when those true leaves start to emerge, that root growth starts to expand. They're going to need more water. And sometimes you're going to need to water them every day. Also keep an eye on how quickly and how often you're having to water. If you're having to water constantly, if once a day is not enough, then this is a telltale sign that your plant has overstayed its welcome in that particular pot and it needs to have a bigger pot, which is a clue that you need to pot up. That's one of the biggest things that I look at when my plants are in a container. If I have to water them every day to keep them from wilting, I know they need a bigger space. So I need to either pot up or get them ready to plant out in the garden. If you can prevent leggy seedlings, stunted seedlings, and wilted seedlings, then you're well on your way to a successful seed starting season. Thank you for joining me here on this episode of the Beginner's Garden Podcast here on YouTube. And if you're a podcast listener, we have over 300 episodes in our back catalog. You can check out wherever you listen to podcasts, Apple Podcasts. Also, you can go to my website at journeywithjill.net/podcast for all the back episodes back to episode number 1. I will be sharing more with you about my indoor seed starting journey and what I'm doing this year in my garden here on YouTube. So if you're wanting to go along with me as I do all of this in my garden, make sure to subscribe for more. Thank you for watching.